At 10:17 a.m. on the 22nd of June 1916, the morning shift at the Tomboy Mine in Telluride, Colorado, started their descent. The cage, a steel platform suspended from a single cable, carried 26 men. The shaft plunged 2,400 feet into the earth in just under 3 minutes. Everything seemed normal. The men had worked the same route for months. The hoist operator, a veteran named William Grimes, had logged 17 years underground. He watched the cable unwind, felt the familiar weight. At 10:19, he noticed a slight hitch in the tension. The cage had not reached the bottom station. He slowed the winch. At 10:20, a muffled blast rose from the shaft. The cable went slack. Grimes stopped the hoist dead. He tried to call down using the mine telephone. No answer. He tried again, still nothing. At 10:22, he saw a gray cloud of dust and smoke billowing up from the shaft opening. He sounded the emergency siren. At 10:25, the surface foreman, a man named John McPherson, arrived at the collar. He ordered a rescue cage to be prepared, but the shaft was filled with thick, acrid smoke. At 10:30, the first rescue team descended. They could only go as far as the 500-foot level where the air became unbreathable. They tried to lower oxygen tanks. The smoke forced them back. At 10:45, the mine superintendent called the company office in Telluride. He told them there had been a blast. He said he suspected a methane ignition. The company doctor was summoned. At 11, a second rescue team, equipped with self-contained breathing apparatus borrowed from the nearby smuggler mine, arrived by truck. At 11:15, a telephone call came from a miner trapped at the 1,300-foot level. He said the cage had been destroyed. He said there were bodies in the drift. The line went dead. At 11:30, the rescue team entered the shaft. They found the cage wreckage at the 1,900-foot level. The platform had been blown upward, then dropped. The cable had snapped. The team reached the bottom station at 11:50. They found 6 men alive but injured. The other 20 were dead. The bodies were scattered across the stopes and crosscuts. The cause was clear. A buildup of methane gas had been ignited by the spark of a steel drill striking quartz. The mine had no working methane detection system. The company had ignored previous warnings. How could this have happened? The Tomboy Mine was not a new operation. It had been in production since 1893. It was one of the richest gold mines in the San Juan Mountains. At its peak, it employed over 400 men. The ore grade was high, the profits enormous. But safety was an afterthought. The mine had been cited by state inspectors 3 times in the previous year for inadequate ventilation. The owner, the Tomboy Gold Mining Company, had paid the fines and done nothing. The foreman who reported the smell of gas the night before the blast was named Antonio Rossi. He was an Italian immigrant, a shift boss with 12 years underground. He told the superintendent that the air in the lower levels felt heavy, that the canaries brought into the mine had been agitated. The superintendent told him to keep working. The canaries died the next morning. No one stopped the shift. The investigators arrived the following week. The state mine inspector, a man named Thomas Kane, walked the drifts. He collected samples of the rock in the air. He interviewed survivors. He found that the fan system installed in 1910 had not been maintained. The main fan had been running at half speed for months. The company claimed it was a cost-saving measure. Kane determined that the methane had accumulated in a dead-end stope where the miners had been drilling. The drill caps were of a type known to produce sparks. The combination was inevitable. The report listed 3 direct causes: failure to ventilate, failure to detect gas, failure to use non-sparking tools. It listed 1 indirect cause: the company's refusal to act on warnings. But the hidden history of the Tomboy Mine is not only about the explosion. It is about the town that surrounded it. Telluride in 1916 was a community of about 3,000 people. 2/3 of them were immigrants. Italians, Finns, Slovenians, Mexicans, and Chinese lived in separate neighborhoods, spoke separate languages, and worked separate jobs. The miners earned an average of $3 a day. The company owned the boarding houses, the general store, the hospital. A miner who was injured lost his pay. A miner who complained was blacklisted. The union had been broken in the 1904 strike when the state militia occupied the town. After that, any attempt to organize was met with dismissal and deportation. The dead miners that day included 14 Italians, 4 Finns, 1 Swede, and 1 American. The company shipped the bodies to the surface in canvas bags. The funeral processions stretched across the valley. The company paid for the coffins but charged the families for the headstones. The widows were given a one-time payment of $200, no pension, no compensation. The company's lawyers argued that the explosion was an act of God. The state inspector disagreed but had no power to prosecute. The case went to district court where a jury ruled in favor of the company. The ruling was upheld on appeal. What investigators found after the explosion was a pattern of neglect that extended beyond the Tomboy. They discovered that dozens of mines across the San Juan Mountains operated under the same conditions. The Colorado Bureau of Mines had only 4 inspectors for over 700 active mines. The law required inspections once a year. In practice, many mines went years without a visit. The companies kept two sets of books, one for official inspection, one for reality. The accident reports were often falsified. The cause of death was often recorded as falls or rock bursts, even when gas was the real culprit. The system relied on the honesty of the operators. The operators were not honest. The human consequences were severe. The 20 men who died left behind 83 dependents. Most of the wives took in laundry or worked in the boarding houses. Some moved to other mining towns, hoping for better luck. The children grew up in the shadow of the mine. The companies had built the towns, but they did not own the families. The towns themselves were fragile. When the ore ran out, the company abandoned the shafts, the buildings, the people. Telluride survived because of its scenery, because of the ski resort that came later. But dozens of other towns did not. The hidden history of old mining towns in Colorado is not only a story of gold and silver. It is a story of extraction that came at a human cost. It is a story of men who went down into the earth and did not come back. It is a story of warnings that were ignored, systems that failed, and a legal structure that protected profits over lives. The explosion at the Tomboy Mine in 1916 is one moment in that longer history. But it is a moment that reveals the machinery of the industry, how it operated, who it served, and who it left behind. Today, the Tomboy Mine is a ruin. The shaft is sealed. The head frame is gone. The tailings pile still sits on the hillside, leaching heavy metals into the creek below. The state of Colorado has spent over $40 million cleaning up abandoned mine sites, but the remnants remain. The water in the San Miguel River still runs orange in places. The fish are often contaminated. The hidden history is still present, not only in the archives, but in the ground itself. The investigators in 1916 did not look for the social structures that made the disaster possible. They did not ask why the miners had no voice. They did not ask why the company could ignore the law. Those questions were left unanswered. They remain unanswered in many ways. The towns that survived have transitioned to tourism. The mining heritage is marketed as adventure. The dark parts are glossed over, but the families remember. The stories are passed down. The documents are kept in attics. The photographs show men with hollow eyes standing at the portal of a mine that would kill them. How could this have happened? It happened because the system was designed to allow it. The state did not enforce its own regulations. The company had no incentive to spend money on safety. The miners had no power to demand better conditions. The immigrants had no political voice. The disaster was not an accident. It was a consequence of a structure that placed extraction above human life. That structure did not change after 1906. It continued through the 1920s, through the Great Depression, through the war years. It changed only when the ore was gone, when the mines closed, when the towns emptied. By then, the damage was done. The Tomboy Mine explosion is one of many such events in Colorado's history. The list includes the 1902 fire at the Northern Mine in Cripple Creek, the 1904 explosion at the Victor American Mine, the 1911 blast at the Cross Mountain Mine, the 1918 flooding at the Silver Wing Mine. Each event followed the same pattern. A warning, a decision to ignore it, a catastrophe, a handful of fines, a story forgot. The cumulative effect is a landscape dotted with the remains of these towns, their cemeteries full of young men, their streams polluted, their soil scarred. The opening segment of this history begins with a precise moment, 10:17 a.m. on the 22nd of June 1916 at the Tomboy Mine. But the story does not end there. It continues through the century that followed, through the boom and bust, through the rise of labor organizing, through the environmental movement, through the slow, incomplete process of remembering. The hidden history is not hidden because it is unknown. It is hidden because it is uncomfortable. It is hidden because it reveals the cost of progress. To uncover it is to confront the question of what we are willing to sacrifice for wealth. That question has not been answered. It is still being asked in every mining town that still stands and in every one that has disappeared. At 4:17 a.m. on the 8th of November 1904, a fire broke out in the Victor American Mine located in the Cripple Creek Mining District. The mine was one of the deepest in the region, extending nearly 2,000 feet below the surface. The night shift had been working since midnight. The fire started in a timbered drift on the 1,200-foot level. The cause was later determined to be a faulty electrical cable that had been repaired with tape rather than replaced. The flames spread quickly through the dry pine supports. The smoke moved upward through the ventilation system. The cage operator at the surface saw smoke rising from the shaft at 4:23. He sounded the alarm. The hoist was immediately engaged to bring the men up. At 4:25, the first cage reached the surface with 12 men. They were covered in soot, coughing, but alive. The second cage went down again. It returned with 18 men. The third cage descended, but the smoke had thickened. The miners on the lower levels could not reach the shaft. The cage operator lowered the cage to the 1,400-foot level. He waited. No one appeared. The heat was intense. The cage came back up empty. By 4:45, the fire had reached the main shaft. The timbers began to collapse. The hoist house caught fire. The cage was destroyed. Rescue efforts were delayed by the lack of proper equipment. The mine had a single breathing apparatus, a device called a fluce, which was stored in the manager's office. It took 40 minutes to retrieve it. By the time rescuers could descend, it was too late. The bodies of the remaining miners were found at the 1,500-foot level, huddled together, overcome by carbon monoxide. The final count was 34 dead. 23 of them were immigrants from Italy, Finland, and Austria. The company's official statement blamed the fire on an act of God. The state inspector, William J.B. Davis, conducted an investigation. He found that the electrical cable had been defective for at least 3 months. The company had been warned by an electrician in August. No action was taken. What investigators discovered after the Victor American fire was a pattern of negligence that extended beyond the single mine. The Colorado mining industry operated under a set of regulations passed in 1899, which required fire-resistant timber, multiple escape routes, and adequate ventilation. But the regulations were weakly enforced. The state had only 2 mine inspectors for the entire Cripple Creek district, which contained over 100 active mines. The inspectors were political appointees, often former mine managers themselves, sympathetic to the companies. Fines were rare. When they were issued, they were small. The cost of compliance was higher than the cost of paying a fine. The result was that safety measures were optional in practice. The human consequences of the Victor American fire were felt for years. The widows received no compensation. The company offered a one-time payment of $100 per family, but only to those who signed a waiver releasing the company from further liability. Many signed because they had no other source of income. The dead miners had been earning an average of $2.50 per day. Their families were left in debt. The boarding houses that the company owned would evict widows within a week of the miners' death. The town of Victor had a population of about 8,000 at the time, but there was no public assistance. The local churches organized soup kitchens. Some families left for other mining districts, hoping for a fresh start. But the hidden history of the Victor American fire is not only about the dead. It is about the living who remained and the systems that shaped their lives. The Cripple Creek district was a center of labor conflict. The Western Federation of Miners had been organizing there since the 1890s. The 1903 strike had been crushed by the state militia, which was called in by the governor at the request of the mine owners. The militia arrested union leaders, deported strikers, and imposed martial law. The union was effectively destroyed. After that, the miners had no collective voice. The company could set wages, hours, and conditions without negotiation. The fire was a direct result of that imbalance of power. The official response to the Victor American fire was limited. The state legislature held hearings in 1905. The mine owners argued that the fire was unavoidable. They claimed that the miners were at fault for not evacuating quickly enough. The union, now weakened, could not mount a strong counterargument. The hearings resulted in a few recommendations: better electrical standards, more frequent inspections, and a requirement for additional breathing apparatus. But the recommendations were not mandatory. The law was not changed. The companies continued to operate as before. The deeper question became, how could a disaster so predictable, so preventable, happen without consequence? The answer lies in the structure of the industry itself. Mining in Colorado was not a stable enterprise. It was a boom and bust cycle driven by the price of gold and silver. When prices were high, companies rushed to extract as much ore as possible, cutting corners on safety. When prices fell, mines closed and the workers were left to fend for themselves. The towns that grew around the mines were not permanent communities. They were temporary settlements built to serve the extraction process. The companies owned the land, the housing, the stores, the saloons, even the churches in some cases. A miner who complained could be evicted from his home and blacklisted from every mine in the district. The power was absolute. The hidden history of old mining towns in Colorado is therefore a history of power and powerlessness. It is a history of people who came from distant countries, seeking work and a better life, only to find themselves trapped in a system that treated them as expendable. The canary in the coal mine was not a metaphor. It was a literal tool used to detect gas. When the canary died, the miners were supposed to evacuate, but often they were not told about the canary, or the canary was not replaced, or the foreman ignored the signs. The system relied on the willingness of workers to accept risk because they had no choice. The pattern repeated across the state. In 1911, the Cross Mountain Mine in Somerset exploded, killing 50 men. In 1918, the Silver Wing Mine in Silverton flooded, drowning 17. In 1921, the Jumbo Mine in Ouray experienced a cave-in that killed 9. Each disaster followed the same arc: a warning, a disregard, a catastrophic event, a brief investigation, a forgotten story. The cumulative effect is a landscape of loss etched into the mountainsides, buried in the archives. But the story does not end with the disasters themselves. It continues through the environmental legacy. The mines that were abandoned left behind tailings piles, heavy metals, and acid mine drainage. The water in streams like the Animas, the Arkansas, and the San Juan still carries the residue of a century of extraction. The cleanup has been ongoing for decades, funded by the federal government through the Superfund program. In 2015, the Gold King mine spill released 3 million gallons of acidic wastewater into the Animas River, turning it yellow. That event was a reminder that the hidden history is not only in the past. It is active, present, and ongoing. The towns themselves have transformed. Some, like Telluride, have become tourist destinations, their mining past sanitized into a nostalgic aesthetic. Others, like Leadville, have preserved their historic districts but struggle with poverty and economic decline. Still others, like Independence and Ashcroft, are ghost towns, their buildings collapsed, their streets reclaimed by the forest. The tourists who visit these places often see the picturesque remnants of a romantic era. They do not see the graves of the miners who died in accidents that could have been prevented. They do not see the widows who were evicted. They do not see the companies that walked away. The hidden history is hidden because it is not profitable to tell. The mining industry in Colorado still exists, though it is smaller than it once was. Molybdenum, gold, and silver are still extracted. The companies still employ workers. The safety regulations are stronger now, enforced by the Federal Mine Safety and Health Administration, but the economic pressures remain. The boom and bust cycle continues. The towns that depend on mining are still vulnerable. The question of what we are willing to sacrifice for wealth is still unanswered. At 4:17 a.m. on the 8th of November 1904, a fire started in the Victor American mine. 34 men died. The company paid no compensation. The state made no meaningful changes. The families were left to mourn and to survive. That story is not unique, it is one of many. The hidden history of old mining towns in Colorado is a collection of such stories, each one a thread in a larger fabric of exploitation and resilience. To uncover it is to understand that the cost of progress is not evenly distributed. It is borne by the invisible, the voiceless, the forgotten. The mountains remember, the water remembers, the families remember. What remains for us is to listen. At 8:40 a.m. on the 27th of April 1917, an explosion ripped through the Hastings mine in Las Animas County, Colorado. The mine was owned by the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, one of the largest industrial operations in the state. The company had a reputation for aggressive anti-union policies, low wages, and minimal safety investment. The morning shift had just started. 121 men were underground. The explosion was heard miles away. In the nearby town of Hastings, a company-owned settlement, families ran toward the mine entrance. Smoke and dust billowed from the shaft. Rescue teams assembled, but they had limited equipment. The company did not maintain adequate breathing apparatus. The state had no mandated rescue stations. The men inside were trapped by debris, toxic gases, and collapsed tunnels. What happened? Investigators would later determine that the explosion was caused by a buildup of coal dust and methane. The mine had been cited for excessive dust levels in previous inspections, but the company had not corrected the problem. Fines were negligible. The foreman had ignored warnings from miners about the smell of gas. The ventilation system was insufficient to clear the methane from dead ends. A single spark, likely from a faulty electrical cable or a miner's pick striking rock, ignited the dust cloud. The Hastings mine disaster was the deadliest mining accident in Colorado history, but it was not an isolated event. It was the result of a system that prioritized production over safety. The Colorado Fuel and Iron Company controlled not only the mine but the housing, the stores, the schools, and the local government. Miners who complained were blacklisted. Those who joined unions were fired. The company had its own private police force. The state government, heavily influenced by corporate interests, did not enforce safety regulations. The rescue effort lasted for days. Teams from neighboring mines arrived to help, but the conditions inside were too dangerous. The mine had to be sealed to extinguish the fires. Only a handful of bodies were recovered. The rest remained entombed underground. The company closed the mine permanently. The families were given $150 per deceased miner, but only if they signed a waiver. Most signed, they had no other income. The official investigation was conducted by the State Inspector of Mines, who was a political appointee with close ties to the coal industry. The report blamed the miners for failing to report gas accumulations. It did not cite the company for negligence. No fines were levied, no changes were mandated. The disaster was classified as an unavoidable accident, but the story did not end there. The Hastings explosion became a rallying point for labor organizers. The United Mine Workers of America had been trying to organize Colorado's coal fields for years. The Hastings disaster, combined with the earlier Ludlow massacre in 1914, galvanized public opinion. In 1919, a federal commission investigated the Colorado coal industry. The commission found that safety violations were widespread, that mine inspectors were corrupt, and that the companies had systematically suppressed wages and working conditions. But the recommendations were not binding. The industry continued to operate largely unchanged. The Hastings mine disaster is a hidden history because it has been forgotten. Unlike the more famous disasters in Pennsylvania or West Virginia, Colorado's mining tragedies did not produce lasting legislation. The state's population was smaller. The media coverage was local. The companies controlled the narrative. Over time, the stories of the dead were buried under layers of corporate denial and public indifference. The same pattern repeated in other mines across Colorado. In 1918, the Silver Wing Mine in Silverton flooded, killing 17 men. In 1921, the Jumbo Mine in Ouray collapsed, killing 9. In 1929, the White Ash Mine in Gilpin County exploded, killing 8. Each disaster followed the same arc. A warning was ignored, a preventable accident occurred. A brief investigation exonerated the company. The families were left with nothing. The hidden history of old mining towns is not only about the disasters, it is about the daily conditions that made them possible. Miners worked 10-hour shifts for $1.50 a day. They were paid in company scrip, which could only be spent at company stores where prices were inflated. They lived in company-owned houses that were poorly built and infested with vermin. The company deducted rent, water, and coal from their wages. At the end of the month, many miners owed the company more than they earned. Debt peonage was a fact of life. The mining towns themselves were designed to control workers. The streets were laid out so that the company store and the company office were at the center. The houses were identical, arranged in rows. The saloons were owned by the company. The church was funded by the company. The school was taught by a company-approved teacher. There was no public space that was not under corporate surveillance. The town was a closed system. The isolation of these towns made escape difficult. The nearest railroad station might be 20 miles away. The roads were unpaved and impassable in winter. Miners could not leave without the company's permission. If they quit, they were evicted immediately. Their families had nowhere to go. The company maintained a blacklist that circulated among all mines in the district. A man who complained would never work again. This system was not unique to Colorado. It existed in mining districts across the American West. But Colorado's terrain and climate added to the difficulty. High altitude, thin air, and long winters made mining more dangerous. The ore bodies were often narrow and deep, requiring tunnels that were unstable and poorly shored. The timber used for supports was often green and weak. The rock was fractured and prone to collapse. The combination of natural hazards and corporate neglect created an environment where death was a routine part of work. The survivors of these disasters carried the trauma for the rest of their lives. Widows remarried only to lose their second husbands to the same mines. Children grew up without fathers. The communities that remained were shells haunted by memory. The men who continued working knew they were at risk. They talked about the dead with a matter-of-factness that masked deep grief. They kept working because there was no alternative. The hidden history is still present in the landscape. The tailings piles from the Hastings mine are still there, leaching heavy metals into the Purgatoire River. The mine entrances are sealed, but the water that flows out is orange with iron oxide. The town of Hastings no longer exists. The buildings were dismantled. The railroad spur was pulled up. The land was returned to prairie. But the memory of the explosion is kept alive by the descendants of the miners who gather every year at the roadside memorial near the site. The question of how this could have happened is answered by the structure of the industry itself. The mining companies were regional monopolies. They controlled the land, the resources, the labor, and the political process. The state was complicit. The federal government was absent. The only countervailing force was organized labor, but that force was crushed repeatedly by violence and blacklisting. The result was a system that had no internal check on its own greed. The Hastings disaster, like the Victor American fire, is a story of power and powerlessness. The miners were not passive victims. They organized, they struck, they petitioned, but the balance of power was overwhelmingly in favor of the companies. The workers had no legal protections. The courts sided with property. The press was owned by the companies. The state militia was called in to break strikes. In 1903, the militia imprisoned hundreds of mine workers in bullpens and deported them to Kansas. In 1914, the militia attacked a tent colony of striking miners at Ludlow, killing 19 people, including women and children. The message was clear: resistance would be met with force. The hidden history of old mining towns is also a history of resilience. Despite everything, the miners built communities. They created mutual aid societies. They shared food and tools. They taught each other to read and write. They preserved their languages and traditions from dozens of countries. In the company towns, they found ways to resist quietly. They slowed down production. They hid tools. They passed notes. They maintained a culture of solidarity that the companies could not break. That culture survives today in the stories that are told by descendants. The Colorado Mining History Association collects oral histories from families. The labor archives at the University of Colorado hold records of strikes and grievances. The ghost towns that attract tourists are also sites of memory. The signs that explain the history often sanitize it, but the families know the truth. They visit the cemeteries, they clean the headstones, they attend the memorial services. The environmental legacy continues. The Animas River still runs orange from the Gold King mine spill. The cleanup of the Superfund sites in the Leadville mining district has cost over $500 million. The water in the Arkansas River is still contaminated with cadmium and lead. The fish are unsafe to eat. The soil in some areas is toxic. The The companies that caused the contamination are long gone. The cost is borne by the public. The hidden history is not only about the past, it is about the present. Mining continues in Colorado, though in smaller scale. The same dynamics of boom and bust, safety versus profit, and corporate power versus worker rights still exist. The Federal Mine Safety and Health Administration has improved enforcement, but violations still occur. In 2018, a roof collapse at the Henderson mine in Empire killed one miner. In 2020, a fire at the Climax mine near Leadville injured several workers. The pattern has not ended. The deeper lesson of the hidden history is that progress is not inevitable. The reforms that were won in the 20th century were the result of blood and sacrifice. The 8-hour day, the minimum wage, the safety regulations, the right to organize, all of these were fought for by miners and their families. They were not gifts from the companies. They were concessions extracted through struggle, and they can be lost. The documentary style demands that we not romanticize or sensationalize. The facts are stark. The numbers are precise. The deaths are real. The Victor American Fire, the Hastings explosion, the Ludlow massacre, these are events that happened at specific times, in specific places, to specific people. The canary in the coal mine died because the air was poisoned. The miners died because the companies chose not to ventilate. The families were left because the system had no mercy. At 8:40 a.m. on the 27th of April 1917, 121 men went to work. They did not come home. The company sealed the mine and moved on. The state did nothing. The story was buried, but it is not gone. It is in the archives, in the oral histories, in the orange water, in the empty towns. The hidden history waits to be told. It asks us to listen. And when we listen, we understand that the cost of gold and silver and coal was never measured only in dollars. It was measured in lives. It was measured in breaths taken and breaths stopped in the dark. The mountains remember, the water remembers, the families remember. What remains for us is to listen, and then to act. At 9 a.m. on the 20th of April 1914, the Colorado National Guard opened fire on a tent colony of striking coal miners near Ludlow, Colorado. The colony housed over 1,200 men, women, and children who had been evicted from company housing after the strike began. The miners had gathered for a funeral that morning for a child killed earlier in the conflict. The militia had been encircling the camp for days. At 9, they used a machine gun mounted on a ridge above the tents. The first volley tore through canvas and wood. People ran, children screamed, the militia advanced. What happened? The strike at Ludlow was part of the Colorado Coalfield War, a 14-month conflict between the United Mine Workers and the Rockefeller-controlled Colorado Fuel and Iron Company. The miners demanded recognition of their union, higher wages, and safer working conditions. The company refused. Governor Elias Ammons, under pressure from the company, called out the state militia. The militia was actually paid and supplied by the coal companies. Its commander, Adjutant General John Chase, had previously worked for the company. At 9:30, the militia burned the outer tents. Women and children fled into the hills. Some hid in pits dug beneath the tent floors. The militia set fire to the entire camp. By noon, the colony was destroyed. 19 people were dead. Among them were 11 children and 2 women who had suffocated in the pit beneath what had been their home. The deaths of women and children shocked the nation. Newspapers published photographs of the charred remains. The term Ludlow Massacre became a rallying cry for labor rights across America. How could this have happened? The state had no power to stop it. The militia was under company control. The governor was unwilling to intervene. The courts issued injunctions against the strikers but not against the militia. The federal government did nothing until after the massacre, when President Woodrow Wilson sent federal troops to restore order. By then, the damage was done. The strike continued for another 8 months but ultimately failed. The union was not recognized. The company blacklisted the survivors. The families who had lost everything were given nothing. Investigators later examined the events. A congressional committee found that the militia had acted with unnecessary violence. But no militia member was ever prosecuted. General Chase was commended for his service. The company paid no fines. The deaths were ruled justifiable. The story of Ludlow was suppressed by the company for decades. It was only in the 1980s that a permanent memorial was erected at the site. The monument stands on a hill overlooking the plains. It bears the names of the dead. The hidden history of Ludlow is not only about the massacre itself, it is about the system that made it possible. Colorado Fuel and Iron was the largest employer in the state. It owned the land, the railroads, the banks, and the politicians. The legal system was designed to protect property, not people. The miners had no right to organize. Their only leverage was their labor, and that could always be replaced. The company brought in strikebreakers from other states. It hired private detectives to infiltrate the union. It controlled the flow of information. The aftermath of Ludlow changed the national conversation. The public outcry forced the Rockefeller family to adopt new labor policies. John D. Rockefeller Jr. hired a public relations team to improve the company's image. He established a company-funded welfare program that provided housing, schools, and medical care. But the program was not a union. It was a paternalistic system designed to prevent future strikes. The miners still had no right to collective bargaining. The reforms were surface level. The deeper lesson of Ludlow is that the power of capital can overrule law and morality. The massacre was not an accident. It was the logical outcome of a system in which workers were treated as disposable. The deaths of 11 children were a cost of doing business. The company absorbed that cost and continued operations. The state absorbed the political cost. The families absorbed the human cost. At 10:30 a.m. on the 20th of April 1914, the last of the tents collapsed into flames. The militia withdrew. The survivors emerged from the hills. They found bodies in the ashes. They wrapped the remains in blankets. They carried them to the nearest town. The undertaker refused to handle the bodies because the company owned the funeral home. The families buried their dead themselves in a mass grave. No headstones were placed. The site was marked only by a barbed wire fence. The memory of Ludlow faded from public consciousness over the following decades. The strike was written out of school textbooks. The company's version of events became the official story. It was not until the labor movement of the 1960s that historians began to re-examine the evidence. Oral histories were collected from the few surviving witnesses. The accounts contradicted the official record. The machine gun fire had been directed into the tents. The militia had set the fires deliberately. The suffocation deaths had been preventable. The question of what could have been done differently has no simple answer. The miners had exhausted every legal avenue. They had petitioned the governor, appealed to the president, and sought injunctions in federal court. Each time the system failed them. The only remaining tool was the strike, but the strike itself was illegal under the state's anti-conspiracy laws. The company used the law as a weapon. The miners were trapped. The relevance of Ludlow today is that the same dynamics persist in other industries and other places. The concentration of corporate power, the capture of regulatory agencies, the suppression of labor rights, and the use of violence against workers are not historical artifacts. They are recurring patterns. In the United States, the right to unionize is under attack. In many states, collective bargaining has been weakened. The number of labor strikes has declined. The gap between executive pay and worker pay has widened. The conditions that allowed Ludlow to happen have not been eliminated. They have been transformed. At 2 p.m. on the 21st of April, 1914, federal troops arrived in Ludlow. They set up a camp adjacent to the burned colony. They disarmed both the militia and the strikers. The fighting stopped. The federal troops remained for 3 months. During that time, the company reopened the mines with strikebreakers. The striking miners were left with no jobs, no homes, and no support. The union's treasury was depleted. The strike ended in December 1904. The miners returned to work under the same conditions they had tried to change. The human consequences of Ludlow were deep and lasting. The children who survived grew up in poverty. Many developed respiratory problems from the smoke. The women who lost their husbands never remarried. The men who had led the strike were blacklisted across the state. Some changed their names and moved to other regions. Some went to prison on trumped-up charges. The community that had existed before the strike was scattered. The culture of solidarity that had sustained them was broken. The hidden history of Ludlow is preserved in the archives. The Colorado Historical Society holds the records of the strike. The Rockefeller Archive Center holds the company's internal correspondence. The United Mine Workers of America holds the union's files. Together, they tell a story of deliberate violence, calculated deception, and failed justice. The documents show that the company had planned for military action months before the massacre. They show that the governor was aware of the plans. They show that the federal government chose not to intervene. The environmental legacy of Ludlow is minimal compared to other mining sites, but the site itself remains a memorial. The tent colony area is now a grassy field. A stone monument stands near the road. The names of the dead are carved in limestone. The monument was defaced several times over the years by people who opposed the union. It has been repaired. It still stands. At 8 a.m. on the 20th of April, 2014, 100 years after the massacre, a ceremony was held at the Ludlow Monument. Descendants of the miners and descendants of the company officials gathered together. They laid wreaths. They read the names of the dead. They observed a moment of silence. A speaker from the United Mine Workers of America said that the fight was not over. The fight continues. The hidden history of old mining towns is a history of violence, but it is also a history of courage. The miners who went on strike at Ludlow knew they were risking everything. They knew the militia might come. They knew the company would retaliate. They stayed anyway. They stayed because they believed that the right to a safe job, a fair wage, and a voice at work was worth dying for. They were not radicals or revolutionaries. They were ordinary people who had been pushed to the edge. The system that killed them was not an anomaly. It was the norm. Every mining town in Colorado had its own version of Ludlow. Some ended in massacre. Some ended in slow suffocation. Some ended in explosions. All of them ended with the workers bearing the cost. The hidden history is the record of that cost. It is the sum of all the bodies buried in unmarked graves, all the families who lost their breadwinners, all the children who grew up without fathers. The story of Ludlow is not the end of the hidden history. It is one chapter. The next chapter is the story of the miners who fought back, who built unions, who won the right to safety inspections, who won the 8-hour day, who won the minimum wage. Those victories were hard-won, and they are now being eroded. The hidden history warns us that the forces that created the old mining towns are not gone. They are waiting, they are watching, they are ready to return. At 10 a.m. on the 21st of April 1914, a survivor of the Ludlow tent colony named Mary Thomas gave an interview to a reporter from the Denver Post. She had lost 2 of her children in the fire. She was sitting on a pile of rubble holding a piece of burnt cloth. She said, "They told us to leave. We had nowhere to go. We stayed, they burned us out, they killed my babies. I don't know why, I don't know why." The reporter wrote down her words. The next day, the story was buried on page 12. The public did not want to know. The hidden history is not easy to confront. It forces us to look at the worst of human nature. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about power, money, and morality. But it is necessary. Without it, we cannot understand the present. We cannot prevent the past from repeating. The mountains remember, the water remembers, the families remember, and if we listen, we will remember too, and then we must act. The act of remembering is itself a form of resistance. It is a refusal to let the dead be forgotten. It is a commitment to justice. It is a promise that the system that killed them will not have the last word. The hidden history of old mining towns is not a closed book. It is an open wound. It asks us to look, to learn, and to change. The question of what comes next is up to us. The mines are closed, the towns are empty, but the structures that created them are still standing. The corporations are still powerful, the regulators are still weak, the workers are still vulnerable. The fight is not over. It never was. The miners of Hastings, of Victor, of Ludlow, of Leadville, they did not die in vain. If their deaths teach us something, they died because the system allowed it. We can change the system. We have done it before. We can do it again. At 6 p.m. on the 20th of April 1914, the last survivor of the tent colony was rescued from a coal shed near Ludlow. Her name was Sophia Babylonia. She was a Greek immigrant. She had been hiding for 8 hours. Her husband was among the dead. She was 8 months pregnant. She gave birth to a son 3 weeks later. She named him Ludlow. He lived to be 92 years old. He never visited the memorial. He said he did not need to. He carried it with him. The hidden history is personal. It is made of these small stories that together form a larger truth. The truth is that the cost of gold and silver and coal was never measured only in dollars. It was measured in lives. It was measured in breaths taken and breaths stopped in the dark. It was measured in the tears of widows and the silence of children. The mountains remember. The water remembers. The families remember. And as long as any of them remain, the hidden history is not hidden. It is waiting. It is asking to be heard. At 10:30 a.m. on the 27th of April 1917, a fire broke out in the Victor American Fuel Company's Hastings Mine in Las Animas County, Colorado. The mine was located at the base of a canyon, 10 miles north of Trinidad. It was a deep shaft mine with multiple levels. The fire started in the number 1 entry on the 6th level. The cause was never conclusively determined, but investigators believed it was ignited by a carbide lamp or a short circuit in the electrical wiring. Within minutes, the flames spread through the timber supports and coal dust. The ventilation system carried smoke and poisonous gases upward through the shaft. At 10:45 a.m., the mine superintendent ordered an evacuation. The hoist operator began bringing men to the surface. 24 men made it out in the first cage. Then the hoist cable snapped. The cage dropped into the shaft. The fire continued to spread. Rescue teams from surrounding mines arrived by noon. They could not enter the lower levels because of the carbon monoxide. By 2 p.m., the company declared the mine sealed. They pumped steam into the shaft to smother the fire. The steam did not put out the flames. It only pushed the smoke deeper into the workings. The trapped miners had no escape. At 6 p.m. on the 28th of April, the fire was brought under control. Rescue teams descended in modified breathing apparatuses. They found bodies in the 5th level, lying in rows where the men had tried to find fresh air. Some had removed their shirts and wrapped them around their faces. Others had written final messages in the coal dust. The official death toll was 121 men. Only 29 bodies were recovered intact. The rest were buried in place because the mine was too dangerous to fully excavate. What happened at Hastings was not an accident. It was a predictable outcome of years of neglect. The mine had been cited for safety violations multiple times. Ventilation was inadequate. The timber supports were old and dry. There was no emergency escape route. The miners had complained to the state inspector, but the inspector did not file a report. The company had a policy of punishing workers who reported unsafe conditions. The men knew the mine was dangerous. They worked anyway because they had families to feed. How could this have happened? The regulatory system in Colorado was designed to protect the mining industry, not the miners. The state mine inspector was appointed by the governor, who relied on campaign contributions from the coal companies. Inspectors were paid low salaries and could be fired at will. They rarely shut down a mine. They issued fines that were never collected. They wrote reports that were buried in files. The Hastings mine had passed its last inspection 3 months before the fire. The inspector had noted only minor issues. He did not mention the inadequate ventilation or the missing fire doors. After the fire, the Colorado legislature held hearings. The mine superintendent testified that the fire was unavoidable. He said the company had done everything possible to ensure safety. A coroner's jury ruled the deaths as accidental. No criminal charges were filed. The families of the victims received no compensation. The company paid for the funerals of some of the miners, but only for those who had been employed for more than 6 months. The rest were buried in unmarked graves in the town cemetery. The Hastings mine reopened 2 months later. The company replaced the dead workers with new immigrants from Mexico and Eastern Europe. They were paid the same wages under the same conditions. The fire was forgotten by the public within a year. The mining industry continued to resist safety improvements. It would take another 10 years and a series of disasters before federal regulations began to change. The hidden history of Hastings is not just a story of one fire. It is a story of systemic failure. The miners who died were not victims of bad luck. They were victims of a system that valued profit over human life. The company knew the risks, the state knew the risks, the miners knew the risks, everyone chose to do nothing because doing something would cost money. The cost of a human life was calculated against the cost of safety equipment. Safety equipment was more expensive, so the miners died. The human consequences of Hastings are still visible today. The town of Hastings no longer exists. It was a company town built on a narrow shelf above the mine. The houses were wooden shacks with no running water. The company store charged inflated prices. The school was a single room. After the fire, the company closed the mine in 1920 and sold the land. The families moved away. The buildings collapsed. The site is now a grassy field with a small memorial plaque installed by the United Mine Workers in 1967. The plaque lists the names of the dead. Several names are misspelled because the company records were incomplete. At 2 p.m. on the 27th of April 1917, a young woman named Eleni Karas stood outside the mine gate. Her husband Dmitry was on the 6th level when the fire started. She waited for 3 days. She refused to leave. On the 3rd day, rescue workers brought up a piece of his shirt. She recognized the stitch she had sewn into the collar. She collapsed. She never remarried. She lived in Trinidad until her death in 1975. She kept the shirt fragment in a wooden box. She told her grandchildren that the fire was not the devil's work, it was the company's work. The hidden history of old mining towns is filled with these personal losses. Each death was a story cut short. Each family was broken. Each community was scarred. The mines took everything. They took the air from the lungs. They took the strength from the bodies. They took the hope from the future. And when the mines closed, they left behind empty towns, poisoned land, and silent graves. The environmental toll of Hastings was less dramatic than the fire itself, but it was lasting. The mine drainage still seeps into the Purgatoire River, carrying heavy metals and acid. The water is undrinkable. The fish are gone. The soil around the mine is contaminated with arsenic and lead. The state has tried to remediate the site, but the work is incomplete. The cost of cleaning up the mess is higher than the profit the mine ever generated. The companies are gone. The taxpayers are left to pay. In the broader history of Colorado mining, Hastings is only one of many disasters. The fire at the Sunnyside mine in 1904 killed 50. The explosion at the Willow Creek mine in 1904 killed 23. The fire at the Vulcan mine in 1906 killed 39. The list goes on. Each disaster followed the same pattern. A company ignored safety, workers died, investigations were held, no one was punished, the mine reopened, and more workers died. The pattern repeated for decades. How could this have happened again and again? The answer lies in the power structure of the mining industry. The companies controlled the towns, the newspapers, the politicians, the courts, and the police. They had the money to hire lawyers and lobbyists. The miners had nothing but their labor. They could strike, but strikes were broken by violence. They could complain, but complaints were ignored. They could leave, but there was nowhere else to go. The towns were isolated. The only employer was the mine. The only housing was company housing. The only store was the company store. The miners were trapped. The hidden history of these towns is the history of this trap. It is the history of men and women who knew they were being exploited but could not escape. It is the history of children who grew up breathing coal dust, knowing they would die before they were 40. It is the history of communities that fought back, lost, and fought again. It is a history of resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. At 8 a.m. on the 27th of April, 2017, 100 years after the Hastings fire, a ceremony was held at the memorial plaque. About 50 people attended. They were descendants of the miners, historians, and union activists. They read the names of the dead, they laid flowers, they sang a labor song. A speaker from the United Mine Workers said that the fire was not just a tragedy, it was a crime. She said that the men who ran the company should have been prosecuted. She said that the families deserved justice. She said that the fight for safe working conditions is not over. The hidden history of Hastings is not hidden because the records are lost. It is hidden because the system that created it does not want it remembered. The companies that profited from the fire do not want their names associated with death. The politicians who failed to regulate do not want their legacy tarnished. The public does not want to think about the cost of the energy that powers their lives, but the mountains remember, the water remembers, the families remember. The story of Hastings is a warning. It tells us that the same system is still in place. The coal mines are mostly closed, but the logic of extraction has not changed. Oil and gas drilling, hard rock mining, and industrial agriculture still operate with minimal oversight. Workers still die in preventable accidents, communities still suffer from pollution. The regulatory agencies are still underfunded and captured by industry. The cost is still borne by the most vulnerable. The hidden history of old mining towns is not a closed chapter. It is a living history. Every time a mine collapses, every time a fire breaks out, every time a worker is killed, the pattern repeats. The names change, the faces change, the location changes, but the story is the same. The hidden history asks us to break the pattern. It asks us to remember the dead not with silence, but with action. At 9 p.m. on the 27th of April 1917, the last body was brought out of the Hastings mine. It was a man named Jose Martinez. He was 23 years old. He had been working in the mine for 3 months. He had saved enough money to bring his wife and daughter from Mexico. They arrived in Trinidad 2 days after the fire. They never saw him alive. His wife, Maria, identified his body by the tattoo on his arm. She took his remains home in a wooden box. She buried him in the cemetery in Trinidad. She never received any compensation. She worked as a domestic servant for the rest of her life. She died in 1960. Her daughter Alina died in 2004. The family remembers. The mountains remember. The water remembers. The hidden history is not hidden. It is waiting. It is asking to be heard. And if we listen, we will understand that the fight for justice is not over. It never was. The miners of Hastings, of Ludlow, of Victor, of Leadville, they did not die in vain if their deaths teach us something. They died because the system allowed it. We can change the system. We have done it before. We can do it again. The last word belongs to the dead. They speak through the wind that blows across the empty towns. They speak through the water that runs orange with acid. They speak through the silence of the mountains. They ask us to remember. They ask us to act. The hidden history is over. The future is ours to write. At 3:15 p.m. on the 24th of October 1918, a second explosion ripped through the Victor mine in Cripple Creek, Colorado. The first explosion had occurred 3 hours earlier. At 12:30 p.m., it had killed 12 men outright. The company ordered the mine sealed to starve the fire of oxygen, but methane continued to build. At 3:15, the gas ignited. The blast tore through the lower levels. Rescue workers had been preparing to enter. 7 of them were killed instantly. The final death toll stood at 19. It was one of the worst mining disasters in the Cripple Creek district. What happened? The Victor mine was a gold mine, not a coal mine. But gold veins in Colorado often run through quartzite and shale that release methane. The mine had been cited for ventilation problems twice in the previous year. The state inspector had noted that the airflow was insufficient to clear the gas. The company had made minimal changes. The miners had complained. The foreman had dismissed their concerns. On the morning of the 24th, a crew drilling into a new face struck a pocket of methane. The spark from the drill bit ignited it. The first explosion killed the drilling crew. The second explosion, after the company sealed the mine, killed the would-be rescuers. The company's response was typical. They blamed the miners. They said the men had been careless. They said the ventilation was adequate. They pointed to a minor violation by one worker as the cause. An official investigation found no negligence by the company. The foreman was not charged. The mine reopened within 2 months. The widows of the dead received a total of $600 in compensation spread among all 19 families. That is less than 1 month's profit from the mine. The hidden history of Victor is not just about the explosion. It is about the pattern that preceded it. The same mine had suffered a smaller explosion in 1916, killing 3. No changes were made. The same company had been fined for safety violations in 1907. The fine was $50. The company paid it and continued operations. The same state inspector who wrote the citations for poor ventilation had been appointed by a governor who received campaign donations from mining companies. The same coroner who ruled the deaths accidental was a former company employee. The families of Victor did not accept the verdict. They hired a lawyer from Denver. They filed a wrongful death lawsuit. The case dragged on for 3 years. The company's lawyers argued that the miners assumed the risk of explosion by working underground. The court agreed. The case was dismissed. The families appealed. The appellate court upheld the dismissal. The legal system, like the regulatory system, was stacked against them. The human cost continued. One of the dead, a man named Paul Kaczynski, was a Polish immigrant who had worked in the mine for 2 years. He had saved enough to send for his wife and children. They arrived in New York on the 20th of October 1918, 4 days before the explosion. He was buried on the 28th. His wife Anna never learned English. She raised her children alone in a company shack. She died in 1956. Her daughter Maria later said that her mother never spoke of the mine. She would only point to the mountain and cross herself. The site of the Victor mine is now a tourist attraction. The gold is gone. The tunnels are collapsed. The tailings piles are A historical marker near the parking lot describes the mine's production records. It does not mention the dead. The explosion is described as a tragedy, but no names are listed. The hidden history is erased again, but it is not truly gone. In the county archives, the lawsuit records remain. In the parish records, the burial certificates remain. In the memory of the descendants, the stories remain. The hidden history of old mining towns is not a single story. It is 1,000 stories, each one a thread in a larger fabric of exploitation and loss. The mines extracted not only gold and coal but lives. And those lives, though forgotten by the official record, are not forgotten by those who choose to look. The mountains remember, the families remember, the water remembers.